Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Olga Kuzmina, and I'm a committee member for the Environmental and Waste Management Group. We are glad that you can join us today for this webinar on use of waste management guide for the waste management and research labs. This is the third webinar in the research waste series, and I will put link to previous recordings on preparing waste for handling it to the contractors and on classification and packaging of the waste in the chat. Please pop up your questions in the Q&A sections, not in the chat, and we will answer them after the presentation. Please remember to provide a feedback in the feedback poll at the end of the webinar. Today's webinar is presented by Mike Hibbert. Mike is a chartered member of IOSH, and he started his career in waste industry in 1987. He worked as a regulator of his environmental agency in operational management, and now he is a self-employed consultant and trainer. Mike delivers training courses on behalf of many professional bodies, including CIWM. Mike, it's up to you now.
Okay, thank you very much, Olga, for the welcome. Thank you for the opportunity to present today, and welcome to everyone to this presentation. Okay, hopefully we can, see that on the screen, so that's a good start. So I'm going to talk about WM3. That's the guidance from regulators about classification and coding of hazardous waste, and we're going to focus particularly on issues to do with waste from laboratories. There's 177 pages, so I'm not going to be able to pack all of that into the webinar. So please use the Q&A, and we'll try and deal with your questions later on in the session, or we'll try and resolve them a bit later. Okay. So we're first going to look at how and why we need to classify materials, a bit about definitions of hazardous waste, what the WM3 guidance says about coding and classification, have a look at sources of information you might have out there, and then consider a few additional issues that we need to think about when we're managing hazardous waste. So firstly, written description and coding. We need to know what the material is that we're managing, treating or disposing of. And descriptions like laboratory waste aren't very satisfactory because it tells you nothing about what those chemicals or materials are. The other reasons that we need to think about descriptions, understanding what the material is so we can appropriately segregate waste materials. We might need to do further testing and analysis to actually classify them as hazardous, and I'll cover that a bit later in the presentation. Depending on the disposal route, if they're going to landfill, we might have to consider waste acceptance criteria, and similarly with other treatment options. We should be looking to pre-treat waste, and that might involve segregation. And last but not least, and picked up in one of the previous presentations in the series, we need to think about compliance with the waste hierarchy. So we want to avoid mixing. We want to try and look at the most environmentally beneficial option. We also need to consider the fact that there is a requirement on all of us under Section 34 of the Environmental Protection Act to comply with the waste duty of care. And there's certain elements within that. So we need to prevent unauthorized disposal. We need to ensure that if we're passing waste materials on to somebody with an environmental permit, that site is suitably permitted, and the fact that they're not breaching their permit, or we're going to cause a breach of their permit. We need to ensure that there isn't escape of waste during transport or management of it. We need to make sure that the person we're passing it to is an authorised person. And last but not least, we need to provide an adequate written description of waste, either on a controlled waste transfer note if it's non-hazardous, or a consignment note if it's hazardous waste. And if you want to know a bit more background about waste duty of care, have a look at the code of practice that you can download off the web. There could be prosecutions or enforcement action taken for non-compliance with Section 33, so it's worthwhile having a look at that. Hazardous waste controls are about classification, coding, the paperwork to go with that. They don't necessarily incorporate all the issues to do with labelling, packaging for transport, suitable containers, but that's obviously something that we need to think about, whether we have got the right container, whether we've contained the waste, whether it is going to be able to escape when we're actually transporting it. And seeing as this is an IOSH presentation, I hope we're all switched on to the fact that we're going to hand these materials on to people within the waste management sector. And there's a bit of a giveaway in the name. It's hazardous waste, it's got hazards, and basically we ought to be telling those people that we're going to be dealing with this stuff what it is, so that we don't have incidents and accidents at waste management facilities. A smattering of examples here, and also fire is a big issue at the moment, particularly across the sector. So let people know what we are actually giving them. So onto the definition of what is hazardous waste and what we need to think about when we're dealing with that is that hazardous waste needs to display one or more of 15 hazardous properties. And you'll probably be familiar about the pictograms on the right here to do with packaging and labelling of waste materials and chemicals more generally. So those are a lot of the things that we need to think about. The other thing that is really key is that we must classify a waste material if it appears on the European Waste Catalogue that is implemented in the UK by the List of Waste Regulations. So basically there are two limbs to this. It needs to have hazardous properties, but it also needs to be on the list. And if that's not the case, the waste is not classified as hazardous, it's a non-hazardous waste, and we need to manage it in the most appropriate manner. So what are the hazardous properties? I'm not going to read through all of these. I'm sure that you can pick these out, but the sort of things you would expect: flammability, toxicity, whether they're corrosive, carcinogenic, ecotoxic. HP15 is to do with generating hazards associated during the treatment process. And what's missing from here is that we also need to consider whether the waste material contains persistent organic pollutants. So that's a sort of 16th element that we need to consider. STOT is specific target organ toxicity. So the most obvious example of a waste stream that would fall into that category is something like asbestos that has impact specifically on the lungs. And the assessment for whether a material is hazardous or not also needs to interlink with lots of other legislation around chemical labelling and packaging. We've got REACH, registration of materials, now replaced by a spreadsheet, but subsequently we've been using ECHA, that's the European Chemicals Agency database. And for certain materials, we might look to have need to look at more detailed background information and databases, specifically about things like IARC for carcinogens, and the EFSA website to do with pesticides and how we can classify these materials. So let's have a look at what's in WM3. I know that Olga has sent you a link, so you might have had the opportunity to have a look at the PDF before we started. Basically, there's an introductory section Chapter 2 covers the classification and assessment. There's some further guidance, and then a series of appendices that go into detail about how we go about assessing waste. Appendix A is the list of waste or European waste catalogue, and incorporated within that is the hazardous waste list for materials. So the two are combined together. So there is a classification process, and then we need to do an assessment. So firstly, we need to establish whether it is the material we've got is a waste. And I'm guessing for most of you, you're disposing of materials, so we'll assume it is. If it is radioactive and hazardous, then it falls under various bits of legislation. And likewise, if it was animal byproducts, for instance. So does the waste need to be classified? Yes. Does it need to identify what is the best or appropriate European waste code? So that's the sort of classification element. And then potentially we need to do some assessment. And that will look at what the composition of the waste is, whether it contains hazardous substances. When we've identified what they are and how much of there is in the waste, we need to have a look at whether it has any hazardous properties. And if it does, then whether they are above and below the threshold to make the material hazardous or not. So two quite distinct elements that we need to consider. So this slide is an introduction to how we get our 6-digit EWC or list of waste code. And there is a protocol that we need to go through. It's not just a case of opening the appendices, put your finger in and pick out randomly a description that feels like it fits. There's around 843 waste descriptions in there, but that doesn't include every waste that potentially is being generated. So this isn't an exact science. We need to try and do our best to actually identify the appropriate measures. And this is on is in Appendix A on page A7. So the way that we get to that coding is we look at the chapter headings, and these are from 1 to 12 and 17 to 20 that are in green here, 13, 14 and 15 in yellow, and chapter 16 in the sort of pinkish red. Chapters 1 to 12 relate to industries where waste might have been generated. So I appreciate it might be a little bit difficult to see the slide, but for chapter 08, waste from manufacture, formulation, supply and use of coatings, paints, varnishes, vitreous, enamel, sealants and printing inks. Chapters 17 to 20 relate to activities that generate the waste, but not a specific industry. So chapter 17 is construction, demolition and excavation. So that could be an agricultural premises, it could be industrial, it could be a new housing estate. Chapter 20 is municipal and municipal-like wastes. So the way to think about this is what you might put in your bin at home, but those materials are similarly generated at commercial and industrial premises, whether that's canteens, shopping centres, prisons, campsites, whole host of locations. Chapters 13, 14 and 15 relate to specific waste types. So chapter 13 is oil, chapter 14 solvents, chapter 15 is packaging and contaminated materials. And last but not least, chapter 16 is not otherwise in the list. The table is color coded, and you can see on the right hand side that it says 1, 2 and 3. So when we're looking to establish the most appropriate 6-digit code, then we should first look in chapters 1 to 12 and 17 to 20. If we can't find an appropriate code or description through that process, we then look at 13, 14, and 15. And if we can't find anything there, we'll go to chapter 16. If, having been through that process, we still can't find anything, then we actually need to go back to 1 to 12, 17 to 20, and possibly use 99 codes. So here is an example, chapter 160199, and it says waste not otherwise specified. And this description appears at the bottom of quite a lot of the tables. A word of warning, we shouldn't use 99 codes on our first go through the listing. We should only use it if we can't have any joy. If we get to chapter 16, then we can use 99 codes at that point. But I would put a strong warning on this, that if you end up getting to a 99 code, you will find it extremely difficult to find a treatment or disposal site for that waste, because it's very rare that these materials are actually wastes are classified as 99, or if they are, usually there is an added description, for instance, something like feminine hygiene waste. So it's not any other waste, it is just a specific waste stream that's there. So don't use 99 codes if you can possibly help it. So how are that 6-digit codes made up? Well, we look at the chapter headings. That gives us, in this case, municipal waste chapter 20. There is then a sub-chapter heading that's separately collected fractions, except for chapter 15, that is to do with packaging. And then we have got descriptions of the waste materials in the table. And just to go through and unpack these, if we look at 200101, paper and cardboard, it's in black, and on the right-hand side, it says AN, so it is an absolute non-hazardous waste. If we look at 200121, you can see it's got an asterisk against it, it's in red, and it says AH on the right-hand side, and that means that it is an absolute entry, it is hazardous waste, and you need to manage it as hazardous waste. A little bit further down the table, we've got 200127, that's paints, inks, adhesives, and resins containing hazardous substances. It's got an asterisk against it, it's in blue, and it says MH on the right-hand side. And this is a mirror hazardous waste. And underneath it, in green, is 200128, that says basically anything above that is has got MN, that means it's mirror non-hazardous waste. And I'll explain those in a little bit more detail in a minute. The other things to take away from this, on the right, you can see there's a letter 6. That relates to guidance elsewhere in the document. And at the bottom, there's a little U there. And at the footer of these tables, there's usually some description that gives you the additional detail about how you might classify or code the material. Okay, so just to recap, if it's in red, it's an absolute hazardous waste, it's hazardous waste. If it's in black, it's an absolute non-hazardous waste. And if it's in blue or green, it's a mirror hazardous waste. And in those circumstances, we have to look more closely at the composition and determine whether it is above or below the threshold to make it hazardous. And that will is set in the guidance. How am I doing for timing, Olga? Just keep me updated if I'm rambling on. So, okay.
I've been going for 20 minutes.
Okay, keep shouting me if I'm running out of time. Okay, so let's have a look in a bit more detail, specifically at laboratories. And I think, depending on what you're doing, then most laboratory chemicals will fall under Chapter 16, any other wastes. And then when we interrogate the tables, we end up at 160506, that's laboratory chemicals consisting of or containing hazardous substances, including mixtures of laboratory chemicals. And this is a mirror entry. And at the bottom, 160509 is other than the above. Probably worth pointing out that we, in the guidance, if you look at that, it's laid out in colour form. If you only ended up having a black and white photocopier, you can still tell which are hazardous waste because they've got the asterisks against them. So for mirror entries, what we need to do is establish whether those wastes contain hazardous substances, what they are, how much there is of them, and then we need to see whether they are above or below the threshold to make them hazardous, and that's identified within the guidance. In some of the entries in the European Waste Catalogue, rather than saying hazardous substances, it specifies a particular contaminant within the waste stream. So it might say, for instance, containing asbestos or mercury. So you need to have a look and see specifically what you're looking for. So if we consider a waste stream that is contains 1.8% naphthalene, what we will need to do is have a look at the background databases to find out from the chemical information in there and classification about whether naphthalene has got a hazard statement. Once we've done that, and this example, it's got 4, we identify what the hazard statements are. We then need to be in a situation where we have a look in the table 2.1 in WM3, and that cross-references hazard statements against specific hazardous properties. So for this, HP6 is acute toxicity, HP7 is carcinogenicity, and HP14, that is both H400 and 410, is HP14. It's not unusual that we end up with a particular hazardous waste stream maybe being hazardous by more than one hazardous property. So yeah, be aware of that when we're filling in consignment notes. We might have more than one. And then once we've established what the hazardous properties are that we need to assess against those thresholds for the waste stream. So for this one, we're looking at H350. That is the one around carcinogenicity. Then we go to the Appendix C in WM3, have a look at the decision trees for each hazardous property, and then work through the flow charts. So this was naphthalene, 1.8%. Does the waste contain individual substances assigned 350? No. I'll just go back one. Oops. We'll see that it was 351. So does the waste contain individual substances assigned 351 greater than 1%? Yes, it does, 1.8. Therefore, this particular waste stream is hazardous by HP7. It's important to look at the decision trees. There is a summary earlier within in the table within WM3 where it cross-references what the hazard statements are against the hazardous properties and then gives a threshold. So you'll get an indication at that point that it's worth working through the decision trees, because some of them, particularly ecotoxicity, is cumulative. So you need to add together various parts to come up with an overall figure. Likewise, there might be some things that you can't actually assess by looking at the background data on a particular waste stream and its composition, but you actually physically need to test it. The prime example of that is probably Flashpoint. So where do we find info out there for your waste stream? Well, if it's a product or it's a pure chemical, well, the obvious place is to have a look at a safety data sheet. And within that, there's probably some pictograms that will give you an idea that this material has some issues. It has some hazards associated with it, but we need to have a look at the composition to make sure specifically whether our waste stream is actually a waste. However, this is one of the points that can be a little bit misleading. So I've got a data sheet here for material that is a transformer oil that's silicon based. And again, apologies if you can't read the slide particularly well, but it says hazards identification. The product is not classified as hazardous. And then a little bit further down, it says other hazards, none. So that might be an issue from a health point of view. But if we actually did an assessment on this, we find out that in chapter 13, the wastes that are transformer oils, regardless of their composition, are absolute haz waste entries. So if we were disposing of this, although the data sheet implies that it isn't going to be a problem, then we would need to treat it as a hazardous waste, and doing otherwise would be an offence. It doesn't apply specifically in the UK because it was after Brexit, but there was a piece of guidance came out in the court ruling in Europe in 2019 that emphasises that waste holders need to be aware of the composition and determine as much as they can through gaining sufficient information on the composition whether something is a mirror hazardous or a mirror non-haz. So you can't just make a guess. You ought to be doing work to find out what's in there. Likewise, we shouldn't be just classifying material as hazardous on a precautionary basis just to make sure that we're covered by the legislation, because again, consigning non-hazardous waste as hazardous is actually committing an offence. So we need to find out what the details are. Quick recap before we get onto a few of the key issues. So we've got the classification arm. We need to find out what the waste is. There is an onus under duty of care on waste producers because of the fact that they should know what the waste is. They're producing it. We need to look at the EWC code, identify whether it's non-hazardous, hazardous, or a mirror entry. And then depending on whether we've got to that mirror has non-hazard element, we need to think about the composition, whether it contains hazardous substances, look at the hazard statements for those substances, and then use the decision trees to determine whether it's above or below the threshold to make it hazardous, in which case it's a mirror haz entry, or under the threshold, in which case it's a mirror non-haz. And I really want to stress at this point that getting the appropriate EWC code relating to where the waste has been generated is really important. And the next hopefully gives you an example of why that is an issue. So we've got a little bit of an advert here and details for somebody in Yorkshire who is producing some potato vodka with their still in the background. And then on the right hand side, we've got a laboratory container that's got some ethyl alcohol in it. So if we had these two individual waste streams and saying they've had a bad batch of vodka, and they've got that alcohol to get rid of. If we went through the coding process for this, we need to have a look at the European Waste Catalogue codes. I would probably determine, and you can go away and do this if you want, but for the gin and distillery waste, it's probably 020702 or possibly 020704 that is an absolute non-hazardous waste. Whereas the laboratory chemical on the right is probably 160506 that is a mirror hazardous waste. So what we might have here is two waste streams with exactly the same composition, but because we've been through that process of going through the chapters, one of them is non-hazardous waste and one of them is treated as a mirror hazardous waste. And it would be an offence to send the distillery waste off your site on the consignment note. It's flammable. You'd still need to comply with all the packaging regulations, all the roads transport, everything else to do with it. It might go to the same treatment or disposal side, but it would go as a non-hazardous waste on a transfer note, whereas the container of alcohol going from the lab on the right would need to go as a hazardous waste. So we need to sort out where it has come from, because this has an impact on how it's classified. And if we think about industrial alcohol, it could be coming from paint and ink manufacture, it could appear in a fuel, things like detergents and sanitizers, screen wash from an automotive industry, or it might be a chemical intermediate. So we have a waste with the same composition appearing under lots of different EWC codes. And in this example, one turns out as non-hazardous and the other is hazardous. I didn't say there was a logic to this, but this is the system and some of the nuances that we need to think of. Another area to consider is when is packaging empty and what are we actually classifying? Under the hazardous waste regime, there is no de minimis. In the dim and distant past, we said, oh, well, if there's 1% of material in a container, we'll assume there's so little of it, it's not a problem. But the current regime doesn't allow you to ignore what's in the bottom of a container. So if we've got something that's a container here with the toxic symbol on it and it's in a plastic container, let's think about how we might code that. So obviously in the full container, what we're doing is assessing if this was a paint, what the composition of the paint is. If the container's half full, but it's still got some residues in there, again, we're assessing the composition of the actual paint itself. If there's minimal amounts of material in there and it's effectively empty, what we've got is packaging that is contaminated with a paint. And again, if you look at the classification for this under the EWC codes, it comes out at 150110. That makes it a hazardous waste. If we've been extremely diligent and cleaned the container completely, rinsed it out several times, then what we've got is basically an empty plastic container, and that is classified as packaging waste, and the 150102 is an absolute non-haz entry. So we need to focus on what the material is in the container and how much of it there is in there. And again, if you've got pure products, safety data sheets will very much help with that. Don't assume that just because something is familiar, then it isn't hazardous waste. Good examples of that are batteries. If you look at all of these, how do you pick out the one that is hazardous? If you've got a mix of different batteries, then the whole load might actually be counted as hazardous unless you can separate them out. And the list is rather old. It was generated in 2005. So if you try looking for lithium batteries on the hazardous waste list, the EWC list, they're not in there as a separate entry. It's actually an alkali battery, and that is an absolute non-haz entry, even though lithium batteries cause the waste management sector all sorts of problems that when they're damaged, potentially they can cause fires. So have a look at data sheets, don't just assume that something is hazardous or non-hazardous. Look at the composition of it. Another example maybe is something like cement that is obviously very caustic. And if you're disposing of it, then you would need to treat it and deal with it in an appropriate manner. Have a look at the composition, maybe do some testing and assessment. Okay. There is also a ban on mixing of hazardous wastes. There is some background information. Basically, you're not permitted to mix hazardous waste of any description. That's an offence. You shouldn't be mixing different categories of waste. You shouldn't be mixing hazardous and non-hazardous waste, so you effectively dilute it down below the threshold if it's a mirror entry, or mixing it with other substances or materials. So things like a spill dry kit, you still need to look at what the contaminant is and whether that makes it hazardous or not. And the logic for this is that we don't want to have incompatible mixes of materials, because that might have subsequent reactions. It might compromise how waste has been treated. So if you put flammable fuels with a waste oil, that might mean it can't go to a particular recovery process. It might mask or identify what the waste is. As I mentioned before, diluting hazardous waste is an offence to get it below the threshold. And when we're thinking about recycling and recovery, the more complex the mix, the less likely we are to be able to process it. There are a whole load of enforcement provisions around hazardous waste. These were picked up in the previous webinars about paperwork, recording inventories. It's an offence to make a false declaration. We shouldn't be mixing waste without a permit, so that's an offence. And then there's a whole load of other summary offences around the reporting and paperwork system, as well as duty of care. So just to conclude, know what your waste is. Coding is not an exact science. You might go through the EWC codes, not be able to find anything, have to go back, try and find the best fit. Obviously, not every waste under the sun is there, but we should take the most appropriate measures. Don't just assume that it's the EWC code and leave it at that. We can provide additional information to contractors, whether that's analysis, safety data sheets. At some stage, we will get an update of WM3 or WM4. It's not imminent, but it will appear over the next couple of years. So keep an eye out for that. Liaise with your contractor. The more information that you can let them have with regards to the waste streams, hopefully that will avoid problems with your waste being delivered to a site and then being rejected. You all need to comply with the waste duty of care, whether it's a non-hazardous waste or a hazardous waste through use of the consignment notes, checking where it's going, who's taking it, whether their permit covers. And last but not least, if you need any training, get some training both for yourselves and your staff if they're filling in paperwork, because they need to know what they're handling and ensure that you don't inadvertently cause problems when you're sending your waste off-site. Okay, I think we're now at the stage where we can
take some questions.
Try and pick up some questions. Hopefully,
thank you very much, Mike.
Hopefully not difficult ones.
Thanks. So I would like to encourage everyone to submit the question in the Q&A section. So even if we cannot answer it right now because of lack of time, we will get back to you with the documents which IOSH admin will kindly send to you after we will answer it in writing. So we do have a couple of questions. And the first question is from Andrew. He's asking, what about substances that are created in the lab? How do you start to classify those?
Okay.
You asked for not difficult questions.
Yes, I
right?
asked for not difficult questions, and then we start with one. So I assume what Andrew is asking here is that from a sort of research point of view, we're creating new substances in effect, or novel materials that we then are going to maybe not know some of the background in relation to what their impact on the environment or health is, because we haven't got down the line to be able to do that. Okay, tricky. What I would suggest is that we still need to get to the stage where we've got our coding. So we're probably in a 16 code here. So it may well be a mirror entry in that respect. And my gut feeling would be that if we've got a mirror has entry, that I think it is, in the absence of information, then I would go with that as your coding for your EWC code and probably assume that it is hazardous waste.
Probably you also have to reflect on what were the sourcing components for your new novel.
Exactly. So
or similar class components.
Yeah. So, you know, if we were in a situation where you have got a range of chemicals out there and this bears close relationship to one of those, then possibly we could take that as a source example of how we may consider and address it. You know, I think this is where that EU court case comes in, the fact that we ought to be taking reasonable measures to try and pin down what it is. And when we're actually getting rid of that material, liaising with our contractors to make sure that it's actually going to an appropriate disposal route. The main thing is to flag up, I think, that we've done the coding. We've probably got it in that situation to a mirror entry, I'm guessing, rather than absolute entry. And then any information we can supply about what it is, what the composition is, you know, what impacts it might have. You know, you also end up with this situation within this sector where we end up with drums and containers that haven't got any labelling on, for instance, if they've been fly tipped. You know, and it might be at that stage that we need to do some analysis to pin down what type of chemical it is, what the mixture is, and that point then look at the most appropriate disposal measure.
Okay.
You know.
Excellent. So we do have a slightly related question. So you mentioned a few times that it can be a mirror hazard. So there are some confusion about the word mirror. So what exactly does it mean? Is it like a suspected hazard, or is it how you previously referred, there is a threshold, like a limit of hazardous? So could you elaborate a bit more on the mirror word?
Certainly. And feel reassured that this is probably the single area that people get most confused about. So we've got to a situation where we've done our coding and we have an option of either a mirror hazardous waste that's in blue, or usually there is a mirror non-hazardous waste in green. Okay, so what we're saying there is that depending on the composition of the waste, it may become hazardous because it is above or below a threshold. So this doesn't quite work in practice, but bear with me as an example. If we had a concentrated acetic acid, it's corrosive. We'd look at the composition of it. It's a strong acid. We'd look at the hazardous properties. We'd then go to chapter appendix 2, have a look at corrosive as a hazardous property and see whether the concentration of the acid was above or below the limit. If we diluted that acid down, so it was an extremely weak acid, it then might be below the threshold for making it hazardous. And therefore a very weak acetic acid solution would be a mirror non-hazardous waste. So what the process is doing for mirror entries is providing a threshold where if it's above the threshold, it's hazardous. If it's below the threshold, it's non-hazardous.
It's just a weird choice of words instead of just saying like limits, they are going with mirror.
Okay. The other way you could describe mirror is to say may be hazardous or may not be hazardous. And what we need to do is a little bit of work there to look at the composition, what the chemicals are in that waste stream, then look at those individual chemicals, what their hazard statements are, what the hazardous properties are, and then actually look at to see whether it is above or below the threshold for making it hazardous. And you can start seeing that if you've got a complex mix of materials here, and I know we're not talking about this in specifically to do with laboratory waste, but if you've got a contaminated soil, you might have metals and solvents and coal tars in it, and you have to do a lot of analysis and then look at the thresholds. And some of those things might make it hazardous above the threshold for a particular contaminant, but below for the others. And this is where we need to understand it. For pure chemicals or manufactured products where you've actually got a known composition, it's a little bit more straightforward because you can have a look at the data sheet.
Yes.
Oh, go on.
Next question. We still have few. So the question is about a regulation change with the Brexit. You mentioned slightly about the update for the waste technical waste management guide, but what about this Brexit thing? If European regulation may not be applicable anymore, and for this researcher Christian, based on presentations, he sees that the content is similar to regulation in countries such as Germany and Spain. So what do you think? How the UK will maintain or update the regulation?
I haven't got a crystal ball, and if I did, I'd be picking some lottery tickets now. So you know, I have discussions with people at DEFRA and the Environment Agency. You know, things may change, but I think from a personal perspective, what we have to recognise here is that the European Waste Catalogue was developed so the waste can cross borders. And what we don't end up is a situation where people are describing waste differently in different countries that would cause confusion if there is movement across borders. So I could envisage that we will probably stick with the European Waste Catalogue in the intervening period. The only change really is use and alteration of the chemical labelling and packaging regulations, in the fact that we've got a post-Brexit setup with that now. But if anything, you would hope that we would expect to see longer term harmonisation across UK, Europe and globally when we're looking about data about hazards associated with chemicals. So my wish, if you like, would be that we're going in that direction for better harmonisation rather than the UK creating its own unique system to operate. And we've got to remember as well that some of these wastes will actually be exported to Europe for treatment and disposal because there might not be capacity or in the UK. So we're still going to have to use European Waste Catalogue and an assessment system that's there. So I suppose if the question is things going to change immediately? No, other than that chemical labelling packaging alteration. Longer term, we might actually see a revision of the hazardous waste list within Europe, with inclusion of things like lithium batteries, being a most obvious example. Or it might be that the UK extends the list and actually ends up putting some additional elements in there where we think there are some gaps that the European waste doesn't cover, because the EWC is implemented in the UK through the list of waste regulations. And basically what that says is use this list, but there is scope potentially to provide maybe a better and more user-friendly list in the future. So who knows? And if you think there's waste streams out there that ought to go in, or stuff that you think would make it easier, then probably that's something to pick up with the EA and DEFRA.
Okay, thank you very much. Next question. So we do have a question from a researcher from the lab. So
Okay.
the question from Jink is about recommendation on segregation and disposal of small samples like 5, 10, 50 milliliter or milligram scale, especially for solid waste. Because of course, and it was already mentioned by another attendee today, that you can end up in the research lab with multiply of the different kind of waste. And if you try to classify them all, it may not be practical. So any advice on how to approach it?
Okay, I'm not the regulator, but again, I'll
but
give
you are recorded.
But I'll give you some thoughts and opinion. Again, there isn't a de minimis within the legislation, and quite rightly, because of the fact that there are some chemicals out there that even at incredibly small concentrations are still going to have a significant impact on either the environment or human health. Dioxins probably being a good example to put in there. Okay, so just the fact that there's a small amount and it's quite difficult to do isn't really an excuse. I think there has to be pragmatism in here. If we're thinking about duty of care, that is really the driver behind all of this, we need to provide an adequate description of the waste. And the reason for doing that is so that it goes to a permitted facility and is treated in an appropriate manner when it gets there. So I think if we know what has gone into a material and we can have an idea about that, then that's the information we ought to be passing on to our contractors. Anything we can do to make life less complicated, segregate out waste streams so they're not being mixed, is going to be beneficial longer term because potentially it's getting cheaper. Is likely that the disposal route for this particular waste stream is going to be, in most cases, I expect, if it's a research waste and it's something novel or extremely difficult to process, it's going to be highest temperature incineration anyway. So you'd hope that that would actually destroy the material on whatever format it is. So I'm sort of ducking the question, but really what I'm saying is, if you've got lots of small vials of something, if you've got hundreds of them, that starts getting to be a reasonable amount of material. So just the fact you've got a little amount doesn't mean you can duck out of it. But also check that it is appropriate to where it's going to and provide that information. And it might well be that you end up coding it under a mirror entry code as 16005 or whatever it happens to be. And then in the waste description to the contractor, you can provide background information about what is actually in there, or at least what you think might be in there as far as you can do.
Yes, excellent. So we have a similar on-site maybe question to this.
Okay.
So another researcher says that their chemicals are always characterized by the contractors by this 160506 laboratory chemical classification. So she's asking, because they always use the same classification, is it correct, or does she need to approach them to clarify it?
Okay, so when we've been through the coding, I'm guessing that for a lot of the people who are on the audits here, it will come out in that laboratory waste code. Okay. If there might be a little bit of debate that if you had a laboratory on a paint manufacturing site, then maybe we ought to be putting it under an 08 code for formulation, manufacture, supply and use. So don't assume that just because of what you're doing determines where the waste is coming from. You know, and if we were Ford on a card manufacturing site, we might have industrial waste, we might have a lab, we might have a whole load of things, and it ends up with lots of different EWC codes, even though it's coming from the same facility. You know, I would have a preference, I think, that you use the 16 code rather than 20 codes if you were at a university, for instance, because I don't think lab waste is a municipal-like waste. I think we could be a bit more detailed. Going back to the question then, we end up with that mirror entry. This is where, if you've looked on a hazardous waste consignment node, it says waste description. And that's where you could come up with an EWC code that's the same every time you get rid of a whole range of different waste streams, but that's where you amend or provide that information. So if it was a product, potentially you could put a safety data sheet on. If it's something that you've got an analysis for, so for a lot of the waste sector, they might be analysing production waste from somewhere, or even the manufacturer might be having an analysis of a filter sludge or something. You would amend that there. If it was a contaminated soil, then you might have pages and pages of analysis. So that's where you provide the detail, even though the EWC code for the waste you're sending out might be identical every time. And that description might also break down into container size, how many of them are, and consignment notes. Actually, the weight should be determined in kilograms as well.
Okay, we have a question about the guide. So
yeah,
Jack asks, with regards to the waste acceptance at landfill sites, is there a section in WM3 that will assist with reading soil reports so that I can determine if waste is inert or non-hazardous or hazardous?
Oh, how long have you got, Jack? Okay, right. I'll try and pick up a few pointers, and maybe if you want some additional information on this afterwards, I can signpost you to other people and some guidance. Okay. So with the contaminated soil,
and just before you're starting answering, sorry, we have 2 minutes before.
Okay, I'll try to be quick then. So soils are very difficult because they could have a massive range of contaminants. Okay, so it is a mirror entry. We then need to do some analysis. There is a complication that for metals you need to take the worst scenario, depending on what the molecular structure is. So soils are very difficult. There is a difference between WAC testing and hazardous waste. So one of the things that we really need to pick up is that haz waste classification is around hazard, not about risk. Okay, WAC testing is completely separate. So for waste acceptance testing for landfill, what we're looking at is the solubility of materials within that waste. And that's what the WAC test is interested in, so that when it goes to landfill, what might actually leach out of it. The haz waste element is determining whether it is a haz waste, not whether it's suitable for going for a particular landfill site or whether it is any criteria around the WAC test. So they're two separate things completely, even though they interlink. And there might well be that there are some hazardous wastes out there that are hazardous, but would be completely insoluble. And an example of that would be CRT glass. It's got a lot of lead in it, and is a hazardous waste, but obviously that lead isn't going to leach out, but you'd still have to do a leaching test for WAC. So this is quite a complex area, and there is some background info I can provide and point people in the direction if they want that. But don't confuse that by doing an analysis for a WAC test, that tells you whether it's hazardous or not. It doesn't.
Excellent. Thank you very much. We are right on time. I would like to thank everyone who participated in our webinars today. Thank you very much, Mike, for your insightful presentation and a lot of advice given to our attendees. Thanks a lot. And I will see everyone else at our next webinar. Stay in touch. Thank you, Mike.
Thank you very much, Olga.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.